He saw the gesture before he could read the headline on her face. Gate 47 at O'Hare was a braided noise of rolling suitcases, clipped announcements, the soft metallic sigh of travelers shifting in their seats. Grayson Wolf kept to the edge of that noise, a shadow in a charcoal overcoat, eyes habitually cataloging posture, hands, the way people left space for one another. He'd made a life of reading rooms. It was how he survived. It was why he still had the power to change a moment. She moved as if guided. A stiff plastic collar hugged her throat like a secret. Every step was measured, each small movement directed by the man at her elbow. He wore a bland suit, ordinary enough to dissolve into a crowd. He had the practiced air of someone used to being obeyed. Her cheek bore a pale crescent of bruising, a thin bruise that would pass as nothing to most. It might have been a fall, a clumsy elbow from luggage, a sudden cough. To anyone else, the scene would be unremarkable. To Grayson, the outline rearranged into a single fact. This woman could not speak for herself. Then the hand no more than a hiccup of motion. A thumb pressed into the base of the fingers for half a beat. A small, private punctuation of movement. It was nowhere near dramatic. It was the sort of thing a nervous hand does under a sleeve. The crowd noise smoothed over it. Only his face tightened. He'd seen that motion once before, a different life ago, and the memory sat like a stone. Adeline's eyes flicked up, then down, then out over the waiting room. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. She had learned how to make herself unreadable. Habit and survival had taught her that much. But her fingers betrayed her. Grayson watched the brief motion as if it were a flare, visible only to him. Everything in his chest rewound, a smell of diesel, the late winter of a hospital corridor, Isabella's last laugh cut short, and then forward again, electric, immediate. He had to act. If you want more of these cinematic true crime rescue stories, subscribe now. There are more like this in the queue. He let them board. He let them pass through the gate into the thin blue of jetway light and the muted bustle of the cabin. He watched them from the seat assigned to him, but unoccupied. He watched the man take the window, the way Adeline's head rested too, still against the plastic headrest, as someone clipped her seatbelt for her and smoothed the flat fold of her jacket. The man spoke low. Her lips barely moved. Grayson's plane climbed over the lake and then over the city, a vector inked across a night he had memorized in pieces. He opened his phone and did 3 things in the time it took the beverage cart to pass. The first call was to Wyatt, his long-practiced lieutenant. The second was to a woman named Claire. Not someone from his world, exactly, but someone whose goodwill he had earned and whose hands were honest, a nonprofit director who specialized in getting people out of bad places and into safe ones without turning them into headlines. The third was to a number he kept muted until it mattered. A private investigator who could make a pattern appear from a scatter of receipts and profile pages. He did not spend those calls just arranging logistics. They were clipped the way he preferred, commands that felt like choices. He gave Wyatt 3 words and a time. When Claire answered, he did not explain his entire history, only that a vulnerable woman needed a place to go, and asked if there was a room within 48 hours. To the investigator he said, Ronan, Vance, and an airport. That was all. Each voice on the other end heard a different Grayson, and each supplied what he asked without comment. What nobody said out loud was why he would move. That reason lived in the quiet he kept for himself. He had failed once, and the shape of that failure became a rule. Isabella. He thought of her like a ledger, entries he could not erase, lines of an account settled only by action. The memory came in fragments, not as a story, but as a weathered ledger page. Isabella's hair had smelled of lemon oil. She had a laugh that rearranged the air in a room. She trusted people in ways that used to aggravate him because it reminded him of a simpler time before the long lists and the late collections. She had been one of the shadows in his peripheral life, someone he kept half protected and half ignorant about. He had seen signs, and he had decided there were better uses for his attention than to pry. When she walked out one night with a man who smiled like a neighbor, he told himself he was busy. She died shortly after, wrapped in a story that had little to do with justice and a lot to do with his cowardice. He had not had any illusions about changing the past. Doing so would be boastful and useless. But it had lodged in him like a taste, and over the years it hardened into a commitment. Not again. Not on his watch. That commitment was private, but enforced a rule he kept even when things had become complicated and he could see the world as a series of odds and lines and leverage points. He could also, for reasons he would never confess aloud, try to tilt those odds towards someone who did not deserve the shape of their life dictated by another. The plane sealed its passengers in the sleep of centrifugal motion. He watched the man with the bland suit turn pages of an in-flight magazine and instruct the flight attendant where to place a bag. He watched Adeline's hands pale, fingers stained with the hints of small tasks. A line of red where a nail met skin, a film of dirt that could have been travel or work. There was a small cut at the edge of her mouth. It might have been a toothbrush, a sudden jerk, a careless elbow. The world offered him so many plausible explanations that would have kept him idle. That brief thumb pressed reissued itself in his mind like a summons. He made notes. Name guessed from a boarding pass that had nearly been tossed away. A middle name he could extrapolate from a social media a hometown revealed by a conversation about a school in the middle of a napkin. Threads. He did not try to spin a rope yet, only to place anchors. By the time they disembarked at he had a map of small certainties. The man's likely profession, the sort who insured things with a handshake and a ledger entry, the sort who dealt in forms, and the soft persuasion of paperwork, and a probable address. Cold from a credit used once in a deli near Sunnyside. He had Wyatt waiting at the arrivals with a car that gave nothing away. No tinted slate, no license that shouted whose it was. He had Claire on hold for a bed, contingent on a clean intake. He had the investigator pulling Ronan Vance's public records like a surgeon tracing veins. They followed them. Following is an art when you have to be invisible. It is different from the crude trailing of movies. It is patience, angles, and the quiet arithmetic of public timing. Grayson did not tail with sirens and taillights. He let the other men guide them. A predictable route. A park and ride. A coffee shop where the man paused to tie a shoelace that had been left loose on purpose. When Ronan took a cab into Queens, he lofted a hand to the window to hide his profile. He was practiced at looking ordinary. The man who guarded him had been a step ahead of him for years. That made him dangerous precisely because he was careful. Wyatt trailed the cab on public roads, a sedan that breathed blandness. Grayson took the subway, a different current, descending into windows that smelled of ozone and warm metal. He rode out further than the man. He had reason to create distance on his terms. In his head, the outlines of the house took shape. A two-story row house set back politely behind a low iron fence. A for sale sign that had not been updated in years. A stoop with a single, rusting railing. It was the kind of home whose details were softened by familiarity. The sort of place where predation could flourish because neighbors saw domestic life and assumed a normality that let the abnormal hide. He watched the house when they parked across the street. A heap of leaves had gathered along the curb like a small confession. A delivery box was dented and taped. If Ronan was an everyday threat, these details were his camouflage. Grayson did not believe monsters wore horns. They wore checks and ledgers and could fill out a form the way a surgeon could handle a scalpel. Wyatt did not waste words. He had a way of speaking that resembled a report filed in a calm voice. He signs checks are Advanced Consulting. No criminal record within the last decade. Good. Wyatt's gaze slid down the block. Neighbors will notice anything loud. We keep it soft. They set up a perimeter that was invisible. One car down the block, a delivery van waiting on a side street to give someone an excuse to take a phone call. Grayson's hands went to the small pack at his hip, not because he enjoyed the weight, but because the habit of readiness had become an extension of his will. He knocked on the neighbor's door, a pretense. Can you believe the leaves? And gleaned a pattern. Ronan left at 9 for the office, returned after supper, rarely entertained, never had loud guests. He had been careful. That was not a surprise. What surprised him more was how often predators used ordinariness as their veneer. The more mundane the exterior, the less suspicion their existence invited. That made it worse. The public's complacency was a partner to abuse. The investigator reported small, irrefutable patterns. A pattern of brief rental apartments used for short stays, a string of women who had once checked a box of associate and then quietly disappeared from social feeds, charges that were settled under confidentiality clauses, nothing prosecutable at a glance, but a trail of private harm folded into quiet contracts. Ronan's life was a ledger of plausible deniability. Claire gave him something else. A timeline, acceptance of an incoming person on the condition that she arrive with a minimal Q&A safe set of documents. "We can take someone off the street, if we know they need it," she said when he phrased his request in the language of consequence. "We cannot take legal responsibility for what you do to get them. But we can keep them safe if someone brings them in, right?" Grayson did not ask her to judge his means. He simply asked for a place to put a person who had been stranded in someone else's story. He thought, briefly, of calling the police. There are times when the state is the only answer. But Ronan crafted his days like a man who knew how to hide in paperwork. The public record would not illuminate what his life concealed. Grayson understood both sides of the ledger. The law could be a blunt instrument, slow to act and easier to box into its rules by someone who habitually filled out forms. His was not an argument for circumventing it. It was an admission of the uncomfortable calculus. He would act in the shadow between the law's reach and the imminence of harm, and he would do so with as much restraint as he could muster. The team that assembled around him was small and practiced. Wyatt moved with the same quiet precision he used in past operations. Confident hands, the kind of look that commanded rooms without shouting. Sarah would be the transport. She was used to giving people space to be fragile. Claire would hold the safe house intake. The investigator would feed them the entrance times and Ronan's habits. Grayson's role was to be the point where pressure met possibility. A man with leverage, a reputation that could make privacy evaporate. He preferred not to use his name. He preferred, usually, to be the shadow at the edge. Tonight, however, he would make himself seen, not to humiliate, but to unmake a pattern. They waited for 3 days. He did not like waiting. Waiting rewrote him into the slow grind of accumulated imagination, where he reran scenarios and felt each outcome like a small set of wounds. He slept intermittently. He watched tapes the investigator sent and fed pattern to pattern. Ronan's voice in a phone call was smooth as varnish. He used a laugh that suggested community, a familiarity he curated carefully. On the second night, Adeline made a mistake or a decision. Grayson could not tell which. She always refused such easy categorization. She left the house briefly to get something from the stoop, and her eyes met Wyatt's through the dark, like two signals across a brittle line of static. She froze, then turned, then let herself be guided back into the doorway by Ronan's hand. Grayson watched the shadow of her shoulders and imagined the pressure of that hand on the nape of her neck. He thought of Isabella. Again. How light could be extinguished by small concessions. Adeline's perspective was a corridor of bright, painful points. Inside the house, the air smelled like lemon oil and machine polish. Ronan's careful attempts to make the domestic appear tidy. She kept a list in her head of things Ronan said were for her good and pretended to believe them. Because pretense preserved the small freedoms she still had. She learned how to make her voice small enough not to trigger anger and loud enough to still be heard if someone asked if she wanted water. When she made the gesture, that fraction of motion that belonged to a different lexicon, it was not heroic. It was habitual, an instinct learned in a class years ago, a private semaphore taught in passing by a friend who had once said, "If you ever can't say it, show it." She did not expect anyone to see. She prayed only on her knees, and even that was rare. In the airport, making that motion was both a risk and a hope. If someone understood, it could change what followed. It had changed nothing for years. Tonight, against the city, against Grayson's eye, it became a fulcrum. Back in Queens, the house slept. Ronan showered at 9 and came out smelling like a man who had arranged his scents to suggest normalcy. He hummed a tune that might have been from the radio. He left dishes in the sink uneasily cleaned. A narrative of order. He slipped into the living room and watched television with the remote as if it were A-Rod guiding his attention away from anything too intimate. They chose the timing by rhythm, not by execution. It wasn't a raid in the cinematic sense. It was a series of quiet apparitions. Sarah at a side door ringing the bell as if to report a community event. Wyatt milling past the stoop at a moment when the front light flicked and the neighbor dog barked a complaint. The investigator texted an updated pattern. Ronan had 2 appointments the next morning, and had a habit of locking the front door with a latch he always forgot in the evenings. Small certainties. Grayson stood in the sedan 2 doors down and thought about leverage. He had never been certain he wanted to be a judge. He had been certain he could ruin reputations, if he needed to. A phone screenshot shared with the right people, the proper comment from a reputable reporter, the exposure of patterns in a way that mattered to banks and employers. Those were tools he could use that didn't require his hands to get dirty. He laid out options to Wyatt, but even the language of their exchange was measured, because he did not want panic to echo in the plan. Evidence, he said, 1 syllable. Neutral, traceable. No theatrics. Wyatt nodded. Make him choose, public, or the thing we offer. They rehearsed a conversation that would make a man like Ronan flinch. Nobody wanted to theatrically break someone, but breaking a pattern was different from breaking a body. It was an ethic Grayson had cultivated. Leverage that made future harm unlikely, not a vengeance that offered catharsis. He knew how to read the smallest tremor in a man's jaw, to know where his real fear lived. For Ronan, fear lived in exposure, the collapse of polite anonymity into public record. They moved at dusk. The street was thinly lit, and the neighbors were the kind who closed their curtains out of habit, not always suspicion. Grayson walked the stoop first, the boards creaking in a way that sounded intimate. He knocked once. The sound was a domestic punctuation in a neighborhood of small compost piles and old bikes. Ronan opened the door himself, the way someone opens a door when they expect a neighbor and find instead an unannounced guest. He smiled the right smile, surprised, mildly cautious. Behind him, Adeline's figure showed for a second in the dim hallway. Ronan's hand fell to the back of her neck, an orchestrated gesture of guardianship. Adeline's eyes were wide. Grayson noticed the color and the cut, and the way she kept her hands folded, as if she had been taught to manage herself, as if she were a thing rather than a person. "Can I help you?" Ronan's voice folded into the room like a practiced curtain. Grayson introduced himself not by name but by a very particular set of facts. He had a way of making the air in a room rearrange. "I have some information," he said. "About choices. About consequences." He let the sentence hover between them, neutral and taut. Ronan's expression shifted, not immediately into guilt, but into calculation. There was a man who could add sums quickly, estimate risk with the coolness of a bookkeeper. He invited Grayson in with a hospitality that was defensive. Inside, the house smelled of lemon oil and the dry paper musk of insurance forms spread across a coffee table, a framed certificate, R. Vance Consulting, on the wall served as punctuation. The living room walls absorbed the conversation. No neighbor would have thought twice. A man, a lady, a visitor discussing a matter. It was ordinary enough to be invisible. Grayson placed a small phone on the coffee table and swiped a glance at the screen. He revealed nothing at first. He let the silence do work. Ronan's hands moved. He was an ordinary man with ordinary patience. "What do you want?" Ronan asked, finally. It wasn't a challenge. Exactly. It was the way someone asks for a price. "Options," Grayson said. "Help, if you choose it. Exposure, if you refuse. A clean exit, if you accept responsibility, or a very public unspooling of how you built your life on soft silences." Ronan's jaw nodded. He weighed public decency and private survival like 2 coins. "You don't have jurisdiction," he said. "No?" Grayson agreed. "I don't. But I do have ways of making reputations costly." His voice was not a threat and not a promise either. It was a ledger he offered a man to sign. He gave Ronan a chance that would ostensibly privilege rehabilitation, therapy, monitored relocation, surrendering of certain controls over records, the careful architecture of a life where he'd be under watch by parties with teeth. If Ronan accepted, Claire's network would receive Adeline. Ronan would be required to check into a program that made it difficult to engage in harm. If he refused, a curated dossier would find its way to people whose business it was to make polite men uncomfortable. Employers, insurers, some reporters who liked to chase a threat of a scandal. Ronan considered the option like a man deciding between two investments. "This is blackmail," he said at last. "The accusation a narrow river." "Call it leverage," Grayson replied. "Call it the choice you always had, but never had to make in the open. Give her her documents. Let someone she trusts take her away. Check into a program that proves you are working on what you did to be this way." Or, he did not finish. He didn't need to. Ronan's face turned to colors at once. Calculation and panic. This was, to Grayson, where the economy of power became visible. A man used to bending people could be bent by the exposure of his maneuver. Inside, Adeline watched the conversation from the periphery, like an animal that had learned to read sense of mood. She kept thinking in small lists. Keys, pockets, the feel of the collar against her skin, the label in the back of her shirt. She had no illusion that the world outside would be instantly kinder. She had long ago internalized the idea that safety made itself by small agreements. If a stranger promised direction, she would watch their hands. If someone opened the door, she would press her back against it. When she heard the whisper of therapy and relocate, those were words she'd hoped to hear. Without thinking they were a promise. She had heard promises before. This time, the voice addressing them wasn't casual. Ronan's voice changed. "You can ruin me," he said. "You can make what I have evaporate. Or you can go somewhere that demands you explain yourself." Grayson said, "You can give her a place to be safe. You can agree to be monitored. You can lose the anonymity that lets what you do be secret." Ronan laughed then, a brittle sound. "And what guarantee do I have that your network will honor what you say?" Grayson smiled, which surprised no one and nothing. He did not make vows he could not keep. "You have my word that the choice is yours," he said. "You have your record, and you have your options. You have a chance to be the man you pretend to be in polite company." Ronan's shoulders tightened. He barked an order somebody in the back room answer a phone. He told Adeline to sit. He told her to stay. The cadence of his commands was built by habit. She obeyed because she had been trained by consequence. She stayed because not staying costs more than leaving had ever cost. Wyatt waited in the sedan. He watched the stoop like a man watching a chessboard. He sent a single text. "Make the call." Grayson read it and set the phone face down. He had reached the edge of the trade he was willing to make. He could offer a way out, but he could not, in good conscience, by silence, forever. The moral cost of keeping a predator's story hushed was too high. He had learned this the hard way. Ronan stood. "You'll have to leave now," he said, oddly eager. "I can't have you in my home." Grayson did not flinch. "I'm not here for a long conversation," he said. "I'm here because there's a woman in your home who deserves to decide her own life." Ronan hesitated, and that was enough. He rose, walked into the hallway as if to put distance between them, and came back with a folder. He handed it to Grayson like a man paying a bill. The folder had laminated cards, a driver's license, a passport number penciled on a sticky note. It smelled faintly of floral detergent. For a second, everything suspended. The pile of documents meant little in the grand ledger until someone traced them to an office that could make things official. Grayson opened the folder and let the light of the living room trace the edges of the cards. He did not let his eyes rest on Adeline. He let his attention stay on accessible facts. He signed a small receipt on a form. Ronan handed him an act of practical theater that signaled he could do paperwork as well as anyone. He put the folder under his jacket like a somber trophy. Ronan made a sound, half grunt, half "What happens if I refuse to cooperate?" he asked. The question was not without courage. It asked the only currency that mattered. What will this cost? Grayson considered the man whose life was built on the soft architecture of plausibility. He considered the ledger again, and thought about how a single public document could ripple into banks and leases, into employers and associates. He picked one blunt instrument and one softer tool. You get monitored. You give up contact. You go into a program that makes it hard to be what you are now. You make amends where you can. If you don't, These get softer careers, fewer clients, and the people who trust public record come knocking. Ronan's face, for the first time, betrayed bare fear. He walked to the window, peered out into the street where the headlights of the sedan winked away. He closed his eyes and took a breath like someone considering a leap. In that moment, he was less a predator and more a frightened man, calculating how to preserve what he had. Adeline did not move at first. The exchange felt like a wind that had passed through and left a new smell in the room. The collar at her throat felt heavier. She felt something shift inside, not like relief, but like the drawing of a breath she had not thought to take. The idea of being allowed to make a decision, even if mediated, was something she had been taught to forget. When Ronan spoke again, he sounded small. "If I accept, you give me time," he said. "You won't make it public." "You'll accept terms," Grayson said. "You won't have privacy for a while. You'll be checked. You'll give statements. You'll do what you can to show you're reformed." Ronan finished for him, tasting the word like something sour. "And if I refuse?" Then, in a voice that belonged to a man who had spent many nights pretending to believe in his own decency, Ronan said, "I accept." The words landed like something brittle breaking. Grayson did not smile. He stepped back and closed the door as if the motion could compress the space between harm and restitution into a manageable box. He had what he needed on paper. He had permission from the man who had cultivated ordinary anonymity. He had something else. To a list of obligations Ronan would now owe two people with power and eyes. Outside, Wyatt exhaled and let his shoulders drop. He sent a short message to Claire. "We have a window." It was not a rescue yet. That would come later. But it was the hinge. They waited until the last table lamp had gone dark and the city held its breath in seasonal cold. Grayson watched Adeline packing a small bag near the front door. She moved like someone careful with limited possessions. There was a shy economy to her movements. She put a toothbrush into the side pocket. A small, intimate inventory of personhood. She held each object for a second, as if to remind herself of its right to exist in her hands. He could have spoken many things. He said one, "You can choose to come with me, or you can choose to stay until something else feels safe. Either is yours." She looked at him like someone seeing if an offer contained truth. She reached for the collar at her throat, and then, as if testing whether it still marked her, she pushed it down enough to breathe. The collar made a small crackling sound against her skin. She put the bag over her shoulder and then, with the smallest of nods, moved toward the door. At the threshold, she paused and made the motion again, only this time it was not toward the man with the bland suit. It was toward the street, toward the spare sedan, toward the possibility of a life unclipped by someone else's hand. The movement was tiny, and Grayson felt it as if it were an impact. A bell rung somewhere inside. He opened the door. The winter air hit them, sharp and merciful. A streetlight painted the stoop in same yellow that had touched the houses across the block. Sarah waited on the sidewalk like someone who had been standing watch for a long time and had learned not to fidget. She spoke to Adeline like a person who believed in small courtesies. "We have a place for you. It will be safe. We'll help you get medical attention first." Adeline nodded. She stepped down the stoop, without looking back, toward Ronan. He stood at the window and watched them through the glass until they disappeared around the corner. When the sedan's doors shut, the world took a breath and resumed its ordinary noise. They did not celebrate. There was no cinematic exhale. Grayson felt the residual weight of Isabella like a temperature at the back of his skull. The quiet knowledge that he had been given the chance to correct a ledger in one place but could not repair whole ledgers of harm. He had done what he had not done for Isabella. That did not make him whole. Back at the safe house, the intake room was warm and smelled of coffee and clean linens. Claire met them at the door with a clipboard and hands that had stopped shaking years ago. Hands that had built a network of beds and lawyers and therapists and the patience to wait for people to unspool. She looked at Adeline, and then at Grayson, with a curiosity that had been tempered into a steadiness. "We'll start with medical," she said. "Then a safe name, then the process. You're not required to say anything you don't want to." Adeline let herself be led into a small room where a nurse checked her bruises and gave her a paper cup of tea that felt like an apology in hand. She sat on the edge of a bed, and let herself cry, not loud, not theater, but a sudden, unraveling release. Grayson sat in a chair against the wall, hands folded, feeling like a man who had put coins into the slot of a machine and not yet seen the result it might spit out. Claire's eyes met his. "You did the right thing," she said. He tried to weigh the phrase, to accept it without letting it absolve him. "I did what I had to do," he said. His voice was close to being a confession, and far from being a hymn. "You could see it," she said, a simple observation that held a world of meaning. "You saw what others didn't." He thought of all the people who had failed to see. He thought of the ledger again, and decided that seeing was a kind of payment. They set the first steps for the coming days. Medical checks at a hospital that didn't ask too many questions. A lawyer to handle temporary documentation, a therapist with experience in trauma to meet her within the week. Claire promised no miracles, only presence. For her, that was the program. Grayson left before dawn. He drove back through the city that was already waking, lights spilling like small, private excuses. He read the letter of the night like a man reading a thin, fragile map. He had done what he had come to do, and yet the job muttered at the edges. There were accounts to be closed, promises to be enforced, a man named Ronan to be watched. He filed his evidence the way he had been taught by necessity, with restraint and a careful hand. He sent a bundle to a reporter who knew how to make an archive sing, but not like a shout. He also left a trail with banks and employers that would make air pockets uncomfortable. Ronan's life could change because institutions reacted to facts. That kind of change was slow, but it was more durable than spectacle. At home, in the small lonely hour before the city took itself seriously, Grayson opened a drawer and took out a photograph he kept folded there. Isabella's smile was caught mid. Her hair had escaped its ordinary coil. He sat in the quiet and counted the ways he could make up for a past he could never erase. Action was a thin salve, he thought. It did not absolve him. It did, however, let him sleep without pretending that contortion and calculation were the same as penance. He did not expect gratitude, nor did he hope for it, but he kept a list of small rules. Notice the gesture, follow the thread, act with restraint, place the person at the center of the rescue. Those rules were imperfect and sometimes compromised by his other life, yet they were all he had. A week later, the investigator sent him a brief update. Ronan had enrolled in a monitored program under an alias. His accounts had been made visible to a small set of professionals, and his social media had been pruned by a person who specialized in record hygiene. The reporter he had nudged wrote a piece that was careful, not accusatory, but oriented toward facts. It was enough to make some clients rethink the wisdom of association. Grayson read the update with a kind of dispassion he had learned to cultivate. He felt a hollow satisfaction, like a man who had avoided an accident by steering just in time. It did not replace what he owed and what he had lost. It was, however, a ledger entry that balanced, briefly, on the right side. In a file labeled with dates, he scarcely allowed himself to speak. He placed an envelope Claire had given him. 4 next steps. Inside was a single folded letter from Adeline, written in a small, tight hand. He did not open it in the car. He carried it home like something that might break if rushed. That night, he sat at his kitchen table and finally unfolded the paper. Her handwriting was less artful than most, the letters leaning into one another like people afraid to stand alone. The letter did not demand miracles. It thanked him in small measures. A line about a cup of tea that had been the first kindness she had accepted in years. Another about a therapist who had made her feel as if her voice could come back in slowly recognizable pieces. She had words that suggested a future built of small actions, a part-time job at a library, a class she wanted to take. There was no sweeping redemption in the letter. There was, instead, the modest trajectory of someone reclaiming a life. Grayson folded the paper back along its original crease and placed it in the envelope like a relic. He did not know if he deserved the thanks. He only knew that the presence of her words altered the taste in his mouth. He lived with the knowledge that his methods were morally porous. He had traded on a reputation of fear to create a space for someone to breathe. He had used means that might be judged by many as extra-legal, and yet, in that small, warm room where a woman had been allowed to cry, The ethical calculus had a different answer. He accepted that ambiguity as part of the continuing cost. 2 months later, a small bureaucracy unfolded around Ronan. He had to check in weekly with a counselor, relinquish several documents to a third party, and undergo supervised contact restrictions. He was not punished with cruelty. He was given a structure that made predation harder to maintain. It was, in Grayson's estimation, a better outcome than the spectacle of a public trial that might have turned Adeline into a headline and then buried her afterward. In the middle of spring, Grayson received a postcard mailed from a city that was not his. The handwriting on the back was hers, short, tidy. "I'm learning to ride the bus," she wrote. "I met a woman who knit. I cried a lot, but it felt like cleaning the house. Thank you." He read it twice, then 3 times, each reading carving a small hollow in him. He thought again of Isabella and of all the ways he had tried to be less coward in the years since. He had learned to answer where he had once turned away, to let attention become action instead of a note in the margins. The postcard from a city 2 states away settled on his desk like evidence that small things add up. Bus routes learned, a woman who knitted, tears that felt like cleaning. It was modest, and therefore real. Spring softened to summer. The systems around Ronan settled into new gears. He complied with the monitoring program because, in the end, it was a rational bargain. Sustain a life with reduced liberty rather than lose everything at once. A counselor logged his attendance. A compliance officer verified the details he surrendered. A third-party administrator held documents that had once been his alone. Banks closed some accounts. A landlord refused a renewal. Employers he had depended on sent neutral emails asking for references. Some quietly let contracts lapse. The consequences were administrative rather than cinematic, which suited the quiet cruelty of bureaucratic correction. A man whose work depended on trust found himself slowly devalued in the market that had concealed him. Grayson watched it unfold as if supervising a slow chemical reaction. He knew the work he had done had not been justice in any formal sense. It had been a choice to trade one set of risks for another, to use a reputation built on menace, to create a safe harbor for someone else. He still felt the edge of guilt, always an undercurrent, hummed like an old wire. He accepted that trade. He weighed its cost, and he made sure the trade produced more than a narrowly private relief. He put money into Claire's nonprofit, underwrote a small legal fund, so survivors could have advocates rather than interrogators, and arranged for a quiet scholarship to pay for therapy beyond what a short intake could cover. Adeline's life, in turn, unfolded in a series of small, significant steps. The first weeks at the safe house were a slow unspooling of need, medical exams that refused to become lawyers who explained options without theatrics, therapists who taught vocabulary for things she had been taught to keep nameless, the collar around her neck practical, humiliating. A mute reminder was removed in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic in the thin warmth of fluorescent lights. A nurse folded the collar into a plastic bag with the kind of care reserved for objects that had once been used to mark bodies. Adeline let the act happen without words. The sound of the clasp coming undone registered more as the loosening of an old knot. She tested new forms of motion in private, a stretch that did not ask permission, a laugh that began as a hiccup and learned to be a fixture. She took a bus route to the local community college and sat in the back like someone practicing being part of a crowd without becoming invisible. She found a part-time job at a library where the world moved slowly in the company of shelves and the predictable corridor of reshelved books. The smell of paper and the quiet shushed away the roar of the world for a while. A woman who taught knitting in the afternoons offered a pattern and a cup of tea. "You can start with a square," she said. "Squares make blankets, and they make places to rest your hands without asking too much." She cried when she shelved a book that smelled familiar. She cried when a patron thanked her for recommending a novel. She kept small lists, a name she might use in public, a class she'd like to take, a friend she might trust. She learned to answer a phone in a voice that was not measured to avoid anger. Sometimes she misread strangers and flinched. Sometimes a neighbor's cat brushed her ankle and she laughed as if catching herself. Progress looked less like a dramatic reanimation and more like the accretion of mundane freedoms. Claire held her steady with a mixture of professional distance and raw generosity. She set out a sober plan. Immediate medical care, legal protections for documents, a job placement, to reintroduce routine. A therapist who met them both at intake and 3 times after to assess stability and needs. "We don't fix people," Claire told Grayson once in his car, when the streetlights made the city look as if it were painted in thin strokes. "We make them safer and give them the tools they asked for when they could ask. The rest is work." Claire's hands were steady, the way they were the first time he'd seen her in a church basement years earlier when he'd offered money with an odd, embarrassed blur of philanthropy. She was not sentimental. She did not need him to be heroic, and she had learned to accept help even when it arrived with a ledger attached. Her nonprofit's intake forms were practical documents that felt almost clinical in their lack of melodrama. An emergency contact, a note on allergies, a checkbox for trauma-informed care. But within their bureaucracy, she kept an open couch and a list of therapists who knew how to make someone feel competent without pressuring confession. Ronan's compliance produced contradictions. He attended therapy with the checkbox present and the guarded emotion of a man who had never had to name his motives without a ledger as intermediary. He stumbled through sessions in the early months deflecting, rationalizing, promising what felt like contrition when he could see it served him. The counselor marked progress in small ways. Fewer, more concrete answers about past relationships, an agreement to hand over one of the passports and maintain a log of contacts. The compliance officer, a precise woman who had once worked in corporate audit, liked lists. Ronan's life was curated into lists, and those lists made him more legible to institutions he could no longer manipulate as is. He wrote to Grayson once, in the peculiar language of someone trying to negotiate dignity with a man who had shown both mercy and menace. "You were very direct," the letter read. "It saved me the lesson of a trial. I will be there for my appointments." The letter felt like a ledger, entry petty, not heartfelt. Grayson filed it under necessary records. Months folded, and Adeline's letters arrived like small ellipses in his life. They were not long. They did not try to fix him or absolve him. She reported the small victories. The bus route she now took without counting stops. The library patron who had lent her a book about birds. The knitting group that met on Tuesdays and had taught her a cabling stitch that somehow felt like armor. She wrote about nights when old memories came unannounced and about sessions where a therapist had taught a breathing exercise that worked like a key to a tight chest. Her handwriting became less tight over time. Her sentences learned pause. Grayson read each one with a sensation he had trouble naming, relief laced with an admission that such relief did not cancel anything he had left undone. Claire kept him informed when the technicalities required it. "She's steady," she said in a voicemail one afternoon. "She's taken on some responsibility at the library. She's agreed to an initial series of sessions with a trauma specialist. We're moving into longer-term planning." Those updates were the ledger entries he preferred. Numbers and facts, not absolution. They let him sleep better and never removed the thrum of responsibility that had followed him since Isabella. The reporter who had written cautiously about Ronan had approached the story with restraint. The piece ran as an investigative feature on how predation hides behind the veneer of respectability, facts laid out with care, names anonymized when necessary, patterns drawn with clarity rather than fury. It nudged institutions that had once been silent into a conversation about oversight. It did not create sensational headlines. It created a ripple. One bank closed a line of credit. One insurance firm instituted a new verification step for solo consultants. These were small institutional shifts, neither perfect nor dramatic, but they mattered in the slow geometry of prevention. Grayson kept to his rules. Notice, act, place the survivor at the center, and use the least harmful lever available. The ledger was never neat. Sometimes his interventions produced consequences he had not entirely accounted for. A job lost here, a mortgage application denied there. He accepted the discomfort of those outcomes as part of a decision he had made to prioritize immediate safety over abstract justice. He also made sure the harm his actions brought to Ronan was not cruel but proportionate, monitored rehabilitation, not exile, enforced therapy, not bloodlust. As months became years, The shape of outcomes came into clearer relief. Ronan continued in a structured program. His movement limited. His communications monitored. His professional life diminished. He did not vanish from the world. He remained a man in the market, but his ability to reassert the forms of control he had once relied on was substantially hindered. There were enforced contacts with a restorer who checked on his compliance. There were legal constraints designed to prevent him from constructing the same architecture that had hidden his behavior. It was not punishment in the theatrical sense. It was the slow erosion of a social standing that had once insulated him. Adeline sent a photograph on a cool afternoon. Someone her standing on a small hill in a park, hair cut in a light wind. A scarf wrapped around her throat where there would once have been a collar, but was now only an absence. She had a knit square in her hands, and a faint smile. Her caption was spare, "Learning to keep my hands busy." Grayson stared at it until the pixels blurred. He imagined the slow work of learning to trust the world again, the patient, repetitive stitching of ordinary days back into shape. 2 years after the night at O'Hare, Grayson found himself in Boston on a business trip that was both routine and uncomfortable. He did not usually travel for small things, unless they involved the intersection of his various interests. Some discreet investments, the occasional meeting with a lawyer to keep obligations tidy. This trip included a donor event for several small nonprofits, and Claire's organization had been invited as a partner. He had told no one he would attend. He preferred to be a shadow at such gatherings. It felt safer. The city in May carried the kind of air that makes the skin remember summer around the edges. The donor event was held in a repurposed warehouse that had been softened into a communal space. Long tables, stripped floors, the hum of people who felt they were doing good without needing medals. Grayson moved among them with the practiced detachment of a man who had learned how to be seen when necessary and invisible when preferable. He listened to a director from a recovery program speak without commenting, then stepped outside for the air. Across the plaza, a small crowd had gathered around an impromptu circle of mats. A woman's voice, clear, tempered by practice, was issuing instructions. Keep your hands open, not to show weakness, but to keep options. The class was a community self-defense session that had the steady, unshowy cadence of someone who had taught before. Grayson watched out of habit more than curiosity. His eyes catalogued the movements, the way people learned to put weight on their feet, the little micro-adjustments that made a stance safer. Then he saw her hand calloused at the thumb from knitting, perhaps, or from work she did with small tools. He saw the pattern of motion he had recognized in an airport 2 years earlier and in photograph captions. He watched as the woman, now taller in his memory because she had gained some measure of her own stance back, demonstrated a wrist release to a teenager who had come with his mother, the way she turned her head briefly to encourage someone. The ease of her voice. Grayson felt something shift inside like a valve opening. He stepped closer. Crowds make small things visible if you stand close enough. Details rearrange into people again. A woman at the edge of the circle looked up and met his gaze. For a heartbeat he considered leaving, an old reflex to remain the shadow in public spaces. But there is a different currency in public acknowledgments, sometimes a closure that nothing else can produce. She recognized him without needing his name. Some gratitude travels faster than the shape of words. After the class dissolved into polite applause and folding mats, she approached the table where handouts were stacked. Her face had the easy exhaustion of someone who had spent energy teaching and had been rewarded with the glow it generates. When she spoke his name, it was quiet, an offering and a question. "Grayson," she said. Her voice had a steadiness he had not expected. He heard his name as if it were someone else's echo, but to her it held a simple fact. The man who had made a decision in an airport 2 years earlier. She had recognized him because she had been told by someone, and because people who teach this signal teach to know their allies. She smiled in a way that admitted no debt and no worship. There was only the human transaction of 2 people who had once been in the same story. "Adeline?" she said. It was not a new discovery, but a naming of progress. They spoke like people who had survived an awkward new pacing. She told him she had been doing these classes for a year, weaving civic safety with practical motions and the quiet public policy of knowing how to ask for help without creating spectacle. "It's not about fear," she said. It's about giving people a small piece of language to use when nothing else works. She offered no sermon to him about choices. She framed her words in the ordinary terms of someone building work around meaning. I teach the signal, she said. Sometimes I teach it to women who are learning to recognize the first things that mean you might need to step away. Sometimes it's to teenagers who think they know everything and can use a way to say not now without drama. Grayson listened and found his throat tightened in a way that did not beg for redemption. He had not known that his interventions could produce new forms of service. The knowledge that she had taken a small motion, a private semaphore, and turned it into instruction that helped other people, felt like a kind of alchemy he had not expected. They sat for coffee in a corner of the warehouse where sunlight made a checkerboard on the table. The conversation avoided melodrama. She did not offer him absolution. He did not ask for it. He asked about practical things, how she was sleeping, if she had a place to store documents, what sort of work she wanted to do. She talked about her plans to start a small community class at the library on Tuesdays, to teach the signal in accessible language, and to volunteer with a hotline. When she described the first person who had come to her class and thanked her for teaching them a way to be seen, Grayson felt, more than gratitude, an awed humility. He thought of Isabella, and the ways a single life could ripple outward in unexpected patterns. Do you ever worry about him? She asked, meaning Ronan? Not him. The question was practical, layered with a survivor's awareness that threats can be durable. He is contained, Grayson said. Not by magic, by people watching and rules being enforced. It's not perfect, she nodded. The way she spoke about monitoring left no room for triumph. Perfection doesn't help, she said. Harness, though. There was a pause. Grayson thought of the ledger again, the doubt that always accompanied any action he took. He thought about how he had used his instruments of power not to terrify but to negotiate safety. There were limits to that power. There were still things he could not mend. He also saw, with a clarity that felt like illumination in a dark room, that his act had altered both of them. For Adeline, the gesture had been a pivot into recovery. For him, it had become an axis on which he measured himself. A way to be less cowardly, less complicit, more willing to trade his shadow for a presence that made life possible for someone else. Boston itself had other things to teach him. He watched her teach a group of mothers a simple wrist release in a community center, then answer questions about what to do if someone laughed at them for being paranoid. Her voice did not need to rise to change minds. It simply offered an option that people could take, if they chose. That the woman who had once needed a rescue now taught one of the fundamental acts of asking for help, sat like an unexpected ledger entry across the years. As they putted in a busy street, Adeline reached out and touched his forearm in a small human gesture. No theatrics. No claims. Thank you, she said, and it was precise enough not to feel like a debt, and generous enough not to feel like a reward. Grayson watched her walk away, the crowd wrapping around her like ordinary life, reclaiming its center. He remained in Boston for another night, and walked the Charles River at sunset. The water was a ribbon of late light, and the city's silhouette made a ledger of buildings against the sky. He thought of the many ways people become part of each other's lives, by harm, by neglect, by sudden intervention. He thought of Isabella again, the shame he carried for having been slow once, and the gratitude that was not redemption but a form of obligation. He had not become something purer. He had simply chosen, again and again, to turn his attention toward where he had once looked away. Back home, the work continued. He kept his office lines open for Claire and Sarah when they needed unusual funds or someone to smooth an awkward institutional friction. He funded a legal advocate who could sit with survivors through angry bureaucracies. He set up a small anonymous fund that paid for short-term housing when the public resources fell short. Each of these was a small, steady attempt to place the survivor at the center of the equation rather than the spectacle of his intervention. Ronan's life remained constrained. There were moments when the man tried to claw back something of his old cell phone email asking to be reintroduced into a fold he had once navigated, a polite message to a contact. Most of those entreaties met with silence. The systems around him were frictional and designed to make certain regressions costly. Grayson allowed those systems to do their work, but he also insisted on certain measured mercies. Not cruelty, disguised as retribution, but accountability that prevented repetition. Years had made the ledger more legible. They had also taught him not to mistake movement for absolution. He walked through a life that had many small ethical compromises and fewer grand gestures. The signal Adeline had made at Gate 47 changed a life, not because of a single heroic rescue but because a chain of people, some violent, some meek, some bureaucratic, had aligned around the modest goal of keeping someone safe. That alignment was not perfect. It was, however, real. On a rainy afternoon, when the city outside his office window made the world look as if it had been washed clean, and the people inside seemed dimmer for it, Grayson found a thin envelope on his desk. The handwriting was hers. Steady, smaller now. He slit the flap with an ordinary letter opener and read. She wrote about a class she had started at the library on Tuesday evenings, about the woman who knit and who had taught 24 neighbors the simplest wrist release, about the teenagers who came because one of them had a friend who had finally said no out loud. The letter contained the small details, the kind a person uses when they are building a new life and want to record it like evidence. She mentioned a woman who had used the signal to call for help at a coffee shop and had been helped by a stranger trained by Adeline's class. She mentioned a clean pair of socks. There was gratitude, but not the kind that put the rescuer on a pedestal. There was something quieter, reports of steady, human work. He sat with the letter until the pages folded into his memory. He had the impulse to hand his life over to absolution and to believe a simple gesture had undone a large ledger. He resisted that impulse. Instead, he placed the letter in a drawer marked records and then made a call to Claire to ask if she needed anything. The call was procedural and tender. He kept to the small rules he had written for himself. See the signal. Act with restraint. Place the person rescued at the center of aftercare. Make sure consequences for predators were substantive rather than spectacular. Those rules were not a manifesto. They were an attempt to make habit into morality. There were times when the work cost him. Trust among certain associates frayed when they perceived his actions as mercenary or dangerous. He lost clients who feared the glare of attention. He gained others who valued a man who could channel influence without spectacle. These losses and gains were not destiny, only the arithmetic of living with choices that unsettled the comfortable. He accepted them as part of a life that was now lived not only for profit or protection but for small, ongoing restitution. On an ordinary evening many months later, a friend who had known Isabella called him and offered a simple piece of news. The woman had been the subject of a small memorial in a neighborhood church, a bench engraved with her name, placed in a park where she used to read. He went to sit by that bench once, an anonymous man in a city of people who had stories. He placed his palm on the engraved metal and thought of all the ways life continued, some moments stolen, others rebuilt. He did not imagine himself healed. He imagined himself bound to a practice, watching, noticing, and using whatever leverage he had to open doors rather than slam them. Sometimes the work was thankless and many times invisible. Sometimes it was recognized by a small postcard or a photograph of a scarf in the wind. At the close of a year, he received a note from Claire, an invitation to a quiet donor meeting, this time to talk about expanding intake services for survivors during transitions out of safe houses. She wanted to create a fund to support ongoing therapy for those whose needs were chronic and who would otherwise fall through the cracks. Grayson agreed to help, not to buy conscience, but to buy infrastructure. People slip back when supports dry up, Claire said bluntly. We have to build bridges that hold. He became part of that building, not in public, but concretely. He arranged for a series of small grants to bridge gaps in care, funds for library classes, and an anonymous contribution to a hotline that had helped more than one woman trace a path out of isolation. His name was not on any plaque. He wanted to keep it that way. In the end, the signal mattered less because it was dramatic and more because someone in the world knew how to look. The moral of the story was not a tidy moral at all, but a quieter truth. Attention itself could act as a kind of justice when combined with support and humility. It required other people, therapists, lawyers, non-profit directors, ordinary volunteers to take up the work after the initial act of seeing. Without that network, the gesture would have been a lonely blip. He thought of the network as a set of gears, a nod at an airport, A clasp of hands at a safe house, the patient typing of an investigator pulling records, a counselor saying, "We'll meet again next week." Each tiny gear mattered. Together they turned the machinery of someone's life away from danger. As for Adeline, the woman who had made a single motion to ask for help, her life continued to widen in modest ways. She taught signal classes at the library and the community center, and she organized a small knit group where survivors could practice domestic arts and social trust in a space that had no official pressure. She had friends. She worked. She registered for a class that met on Saturday mornings to learn the basics of community organizing. She wanted to teach others how to find resources and to craft small letters of complaint that made institutions listen. Grayson watched those developments like a man watching a tree grow and judged the growth both fragile and durable. He knew that, for all the reforms he had nudged into play, the world remained a place where predators hid in plain sight. His interventions were not a cure. They were, however, a way of tilting the field in favor of someone else for long enough that person could stitch together a life. The last image of the story, the one that would remain most honest to him, was not a dramatic confrontation, nor a cinematic redemption. It was Adeline standing in a well-used community center with a small whiteboard behind her, writing the simplest of instructions. If you cannot speak, have a way to say you need a way out. Her handwriting was flat and practical. A circle of people watched and practiced a wrist release in their seats. Someone laughed when they got it right. Someone else wiped tears quietly. Grayson watched from the doorway. He did not stay long. He had learned not to make himself the center of stories he had helped start. He gave a small nod to Claire, who was handing out water bottles, and he left without fanfare. On his way out, he paused by the back row to watch, as if he had the right to be present. Adeline looked up once and met his eyes. There was no dramatization in the look, only an acknowledgement that two people had been altered by a small motion at an airport and by the choices that followed it. He walked back into his life, carrying that image like a weight that felt like obligation more than relief. There would be other days to make hard choices, other rooms to enter or not enter, other signals to notice. He understood now that his life would be a series of small reckonings rather than a single dramatic penance. He kept the rule he had written for himself years ago and pronounced in his mind with each encounter. Notice the small thing. Act if you must, and ensure that the person you helped is the one whom systems hold afterwards. He continued to move through crowds with an attention that was now moral practice rather than mere habit. If this story touched you, and if you or someone you know may need help, please consider reaching out to a trusted organization. In the United States, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-7-997-233 or via text by dialing 88,788. You can also find local resources through established nonprofits and community centers. Claire's organization and similar services offer confidential intake and support. Help can arrive in small, practical ways. You do not have to make the next step alone.